Later today, President Obama will be laying out his plan for cutting the nation's deficit. Our next guest says the deficit is a true threat to America's future. David Walker is with us now. For 10 years, he served as the nation's congressional watchdog, the Comptroller General. He is now president and CEO of the Comeback America Initiative. It is a fiscal responsibility group he founded last year. David, thanks so much for joining us. I know you've said that Washington right now is about arguing about the bar tab on the Titanic. What needs to be done most? Is tax reform foremost in your mind?
Well, we clearly need comprehensive tax reform that will make it simpler, fairer, more competitive, and generate additional revenues over historical levels. But we've got to reform entitlement programs. We need to go back at health care again. We've way overpromised, and we haven't done enough to be able to control cost. Frankly, we need to cut defense and other spending in ways that don't compromise national security. All of those things and more in order to be able to put our finances in order.
David, really quickly, though, the cuts that have been proposed to defense are not the biggest part of, for example, what Congressman Ryan has put forward, right?
No, they're not. I mean, clearly we need to be doing more in defense. Congressman Ryan had a bold proposal. It was politically courageous, but it was all on spending cuts. And frankly, he basically just piggybacked on what Secretary Gates had proposed on defense. There's a lot more opportunity to cut spending in defense without compromising national security. I was on the front lines for 8 years as an ex officio member of the Defense Business Board. Believe me, there's a lot of money there.
David, cutting defense may be a sellable option, let's call it, to the American people, but persuading them that they've been overpromised when it comes to Social Security and in particular Medicare is going to be a great deal harder. How does the president frame that discussion today, knowing that an election really isn't that far off?
Well, first, Eric, I think we have to recognize that Social Security is not our biggest problem. It doesn't face an immediate crisis. To give you a sense, it's underfunded about $8 trillion, whereas Medicare, based upon reasonable and sustainable assumptions, is underfunded $35 trillion or more. So the fact is the real issue is Medicare, Medicaid, and the new health care promises that have been made. That's where we have to end up letting the people know that we're going to have to get back to preventative, wellness, and catastrophic. We're going to have to do a number of things, including not write a blank check for health care. We're the only major industrialized nation that does that.
You mentioned, David, something on the political point and picking up what Erik just mentioned. I mean, it's hard for the president, though, to not present himself as the champion of the middle classes, right?
Well, everybody wants to be the champion of the middle class. Nobody wants to raise taxes. People would prefer not to have to renegotiate the social insurance contract. But the reality is this country is in an over $60 trillion hole. And you're not going to be able to solve that problem without everything being on the table and everybody being at the table. And we need to do it soon because we could have a U.S. debt crisis within the next 2 to 3 years if we don't gain more credibility.
Why is no one cutting present then benefit expenditures, or is that just politically not possible?
Well, first, you have to actually reform the law in order to reduce the benefits. I mean, these are so-called, entitlement programs. They're mandatory spending. The only way that you can cut it is if you actually change the law that relates to these programs, unlike discretionary spending, where Congress gets to decide every year how much money to spend. So that's the fundamental difference.
Explain to people just what a debt crisis like the one you envision is.
Well, a debt crisis would be where we lose the confidence of independent lenders, and therefore they want to charge a lot higher interest rates in order to be able to finance our mounting debt.
So simply higher Treasury yields. They're just going to...
Much higher Treasury yields. We have the lowest average maturity of our debt of any major sovereign nation. We have historically low interest rates. The only player who's buying our debt in big volume is the Federal Reserve. That's self-dealing. When they have to end up unwinding their positions, that's going to have a real market impact. And so we're employing a very high-risk strategy. We're doubling down in the short term, which helps in the short term, but increases risk over time.
So, David, are you effectively saying that the U.S. Treasury has become like Bear Stearns? We're effectively financing our obligations in what is akin in the sovereign debt market to overnight repo and trying to finance long-term obligations that way?
What I'm saying is that the Federal Reserve is not an arm's length transaction. They are basically holding down interest rates because of what they're doing. They're doing that to help the economy in the short term, to help the housing market in the short term. Frankly, the Federal Reserve should not be in the business of focusing on unemployment. That is a political issue. We should get them back to focusing on inflation. That's their core mission, and we could end up paying a big price if we don't end up doing that.
David, I don't disagree with your point, but then why are Treasuries, why are prices still so high and yields so low? It seems like the world is still looking at the U.S. as a relatively safe and stable place to put money.
That's true in the short term. But if you look at what independent investors are doing, they're not buying 30-year bonds. They don't even have much of an appetite for the 10-year bond. If you look at what PIMCO recently did, they're not investing in Treasuries at all because they believe that their investors are not receiving an adequate return given the related interest rate risk. And the Chinese and the Japanese others are not just concerned about interest rate risk, they're concerned about currency risk, and rightly so.
So, David, if you had to rank the U.S. versus, Greece or Portugal, where does the U.S. fall in the pecking order?
Well, based upon the first ever sovereign fiscal fitness index issued by the Comeback America Initiative and Stanford's master's programs 3 weeks ago, we're number 28 out of 34. Greece is 34. Australia's number 1. We've declined dramatically in the last 10 years. We're in a bad neighborhood. We need to move on up.
David, what you suggest requires a great deal of action on the part of the White House, on the part of Congress, and of course on the part of the Federal Reserve. But let's bring it back to the president today. What can he say, what can he do himself that is going to help move this ball forward?
Well, I think the president is going to try to get ahead of the debt ceiling debate. Clearly, we're going to have to raise the debt ceiling. The question is how much and in exchange for what. It needs to be with regard to something concrete to deal with our structural deficits. Hopefully, debt to GDP targets with automatic enforcement mechanisms. He also needs to say more about his National Fiscal Responsibility and Reform Commission. It was his commission. He needs to give us a sense as to what does he see as the way forward to put our finances in order. And I'm looking forward to hearing it, and I'm going to be there in person.
Do you expect, though, David, that he is going to do what you think is necessary? Do you think the president has gotten the message from Bowles Simpson, from Paul Ryan, from whoever it needs to be, that the time for action is now?
I know the president knows that we have a problem. I know that he knows that we end up needing to have everything on the table. At the same point in time, I won't know until this afternoon as to what he thinks the relative priorities are and what timing needs to be. What I know is we can't wait until after the 2012 election.
David, if the debt ceiling goes higher, if that is worked out, what is the one thing that should not be given up to get there?
Well, let's say the one thing that should be there in order to raise it. We should bring back tough statutory budget controls, including specific annual debt as a percentage of GDP targets with automatic enforcement mechanisms with regard to spending cuts, adjustments in indexing and subsidies for mandatory programs, as well as temporary tax actions if the Congress and the president fail to act. We need to have a safeguard and a default mechanism.
David, thank you so much. David Walker, President, CEO, and founder of the Comeback America Initiative.